2 days after I gave birth to twins, my mother-in-law marched into my recovery suite, followed by my husband and his mistress. She dropped a set of divorce papers and a check for $25 million on my lap, demanding full custody of my children. I did not scream or beg. I simply signed the papers, packed my things, and vanished into the night. By 8 o'clock the next morning, when she tried to log into her precious family trust to gloat, she realized she had made a fatal miscalculation. My name is Zora. I am 35 years old, and until that Tuesday, I was the chief financial officer for my husband's family wealth management firm. If you have ever been underestimated by the people who built their empires on your back, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to see exactly how I dismantled a dynasty in under 24 hours. The private maternity suite at the upscale Atlanta hospital was supposed to be a sanctuary. The air was quiet, smelling faintly of the expensive lavender lotion the nurses had brought in earlier. I sat in the recovery bed holding my 2-day-old twins, feeling the deep bone-weary exhaustion that comes from bringing new life into the world. Julian, my husband of 5 years, had left an hour prior, claiming he needed to shower and grab a change of clothes from our estate. I had believed him. I was foolish enough to think the man I married was simply overwhelmed by the reality of fatherhood. The heavy oak door of the suite swung open without a knock. It did not swing gently. It was pushed with the kind of aggressive entitlement reserved exclusively for people who believe their wealth buys them the right to bypass basic human decency. My mother-in-law Beatrice strode into the room. She wore a tailored ivory suit, a double strand of South Sea pearls resting perfectly against her collarbone. Her posture was rigid, her expression carved from absolute ice. Following closely behind her was Julian. He refused to look at me. He stared at the linoleum floor, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his designer slacks. And trailing slightly behind him, holding his elbow with an air of absolute possession, was Jasmine. Jasmine was a junior analyst at our firm, a woman I had personally trained, and apparently the woman my husband had been sleeping with. Beatrice did not greet me. She did not look at the 2 tiny, fragile infants sleeping in my arms. Instead, she stepped directly to the side of my bed and tossed a thick, leather-bound folder directly onto my lap. The weight of it startled the babies, causing my daughter to let out a soft cry. I instinctively tightened my hold on them, looking up at the 3 people standing over me. "You always were just a glorified calculator from the South Side, Zora," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venom. "You fixed our books. You modernized the family firm when we needed it. You were useful. But you do not belong in our bloodline, and you certainly do not possess the pedigree to raise the heirs to this family." I stared at her, the reality of the situation clicking into place with cold mathematical precision. I looked at Julian, waiting for the man I had built a life with, to defend me, to defend his children, to say absolutely anything. He remained completely silent, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like a scolded child. Jasmine took that moment of silence to step forward. She smiled down at me, a sickeningly sweet expression of triumph. As she raised her hand to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the hospital lights caught the brilliant flash of diamonds on her wrist. It was a custom tennis bracelet. I knew exactly how many carats it held because I was the one who had purchased it for Julian just 3 months ago for our anniversary. Seeing my gift wrapped around the wrist of his mistress told me everything I needed to know about the depth of his betrayal. "Open the folder," Beatrice commanded, checking her gold watch, as if my presence was a minor inconvenience cutting into her afternoon schedule. "Inside, you will find a cashier's check for $25 million. It is more money than a forensic accountant could make in 10 lifetimes. Along with it are uncontested divorce papers and a full surrender of your parental rights. You will take the money, you will pack whatever cheap clothes you brought here, and you will leave. Julian will raise the twins with someone appropriate." The air in the room grew heavy. In their world, $25 million was the ultimate silencer. It was the price tag they slapped on problems they wanted to disappear. Beatrice stood tall, waiting for the tears. She was waiting for the hysterical breakdown, the begging, the desperate pleas of a woman losing her family. She wanted a show. She wanted me to shatter so she could sweep up the pieces and discard them. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I felt a profound, absolute stillness settle over my entire body. I carefully shifted my son into the crook of my left arm. With my right hand, I reached over to the bedside table and picked up my favorite heavy metal pen. I opened the leather folder, flipped directly to the signature pages, and signed my name on every required line. My handwriting was perfectly steady. I closed the folder and slid it back across the hospital bed toward Beatrice. Her eyes widened slightly, clearly unprepared for how easily I had capitulated. A triumphant smirk spread across her face. I reached over and pressed the red call button on my bedside remote. Beatrice laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Calling a nurse will not change anything, Zora. The hospital administration knows exactly who I am. They will not interfere with family business." "I am not calling a nurse," I replied evenly. The door to the suite opened immediately. Instead of a nurse, two massive private security guards stepped into the room. They wore sharp black suits and earpieces, their expressions completely unreadable. I had contracted them weeks ago, placing them on standby the moment I first noticed the suspicious wire transfers in Julian's personal accounts. I carefully handed my sleeping twins to the private neonatal nurse who had entered quietly behind the guards. I swung my legs over the side of the hospital bed, tightening the belt of my silk robe, and stood up. I looked Beatrice directly in the eyes, ensuring she saw absolutely no fear, no hesitation, and no submission. "Keep the check, Beatrice," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly across the quiet room. "I prefer wire transfers anyway." I nodded to the security team. "Escort them out." Beatrice opened her mouth to protest, her face flushing with sudden indignant rage. Julian finally looked up, his jaw dropping in confusion. Jasmine took a panicked step backward. The security guards did not wait for an argument. They moved forward with immediate imposing authority, physically blocking Beatrice from stepping any closer to the babies and forcing the three of them backward toward the hallway. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, severing my ties to the family I had served for 5 years. The moment the room was clear, my operation began. I had not been resting during my time in this hospital. I had been finalizing the execution of a financial protocol I had designed months in advance. Within an hour, my private medical transport team arrived through the secure basement loading dock. We bypassed the main lobby, entirely slipping away into the warm Atlanta night, while Julian and Beatrice were likely busy celebrating their presumed victory at a high-end restaurant downtown. I vanished. I relocated to a highly secure, fully integrated smart home estate I had purchased through a blind proxy corporation months earlier. The property was hidden behind heavy iron gates and surrounded by dense forest, completely off the grid and untraceable to my name. My children were safe in their new nursery, watched over by a trusted team, while I sat in my new home office bathed in the blue light of multiple monitors, watching the financial traps I had laid snap shut one by one. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, Beatrice sat down at the antique mahogany desk in her private home office. I could practically see her sipping her imported espresso, fully intending to log into the primary family trust accounts to verify that my access had been terminated. She typed in her administrative credentials, ready to bask in the glow of her immense wealth and the success of her ruthless ambush. She hit enter. The screen buffered for a fraction of a second. Instead of the familiar dashboard displaying hundreds of millions in diversified assets, a stark white screen appeared. The text was simple, unfeeling, and absolute. "Access denied. Error. Code 404. Asset liquidation complete." The dynasty she had weaponized against me was gone, and the war she started had only just begun. While Beatrice stared at her blank monitor in the suburbs, her golden child was experiencing his own technological rude awakening across town. I sat in the climate-controlled sunroom of my new estate, a cup of Earl Grey tea resting on the glass table beside my secure tablet. The screen displayed a real-time transaction log for every account tied to the family firm. At precisely 9:14 in the morning, a push notification illuminated the screen. A charge attempt had been made at Buckhead Skyline Realty. The amount was $150,000, the standard upfront cost for a 1-year lease on a luxury penthouse in that zip code. The card used was the primary corporate operating account. The status read, "Declined." I watched the screen with mild amusement as a second notification popped up 30 seconds later. Julian was nothing if not predictable. He had undoubtedly flashed his signature charming smile at the real estate broker, chuckled about a bank error, and handed over his personal platinum card. Declined. A third attempt this time using a joint savings account he assumed I had left untouched. Declined. I could perfectly envision the scene unfolding in that sleek glass-walled brokerage office. Julian dressed in his custom Italian suit, standing beside a smug Jasmine, slowly realizing that the invisible safety net of his family wealth had just evaporated. The broker would be offering a tight, polite smile, the kind reserved for people whose credit had suddenly run dry. Julian would be sweating. In his 37 years of life, a card bearing his name had never once been rejected. My tablet chimed again, but this time it was a GPS proximity alert. I had left the tracking software active on Julian's company vehicle for my own amusement. A blinking blue dot showed his car speeding away from Buckhead, weaving erratically through morning traffic, heading straight for our former marital home. He was going to my office. I took a slow sip of my tea. The home office had been my sanctuary, a fortress of dual monitor setups, fireproof filing cabinets, and encrypted local servers where I stored the firm's most sensitive financial data. Julian believed the answers to his current liquidity problem were locked in that room. He believed he could simply kick the door open, rip a hard drive from the wall, and hand it to one of his overpriced tech consultants to reverse the damage. I watched the blue dot arrive at the property line. I checked the secondary security feed from the house interior, which I still controlled. Julian burst through the front door, his face flushed red with panic and rage. He bypassed the kitchen and marched straight down the hallway to my office. He grabbed the brass handle and shoved the door open. He froze in the threshold. The room was not just empty, it had been surgically gutted. Over the weekend, while Julian was occupied with his mistress in a downtown hotel, I had hired a specialized demolition and retrieval crew. They did not just pack up my computers and files. They removed the custom mahogany built-in shelving that housed the physical servers. They pulled the fiber optic cabling from the walls. They unbolted the 600-pound floor safe and hauled it away. The room was stripped down to the bare gray drywall. Not a single paperclip, not a single digital footprint was left behind. It was a hollow, echoing shell, a perfect physical representation of his current financial standing. Julian stumbled backward, running his hands over his face. He pulled out his phone, and seconds later my encrypted burner device began to vibrate on the table in front of me. I let it ring. It rang 5 times, followed by the notification of a voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. Over the next 20 minutes, Julian left 14 voicemails. I listened to them while my private nurse brought the twins into the sunroom for their morning feeding. The progression of his voicemails was a fascinating psychological study. The first few were arrogant and demanding. He ordered me to answer the phone, insisting that whatever game I was playing was over. He threatened to call the police, claiming I had committed corporate espionage. By the 7th voicemail, the arrogance began to crack, replaced by a frantic, high-pitched confusion. "Zora, you need to call me back right now." His voice echoed from the speaker, tight with panic. The broker just humiliated me. Jasmine is furious. I went to the house and the entire office is gone. The servers are gone. How did you even do this? You cannot bypass the dual authentication security protocols on the primary accounts. Those require my physical biometric approval. You hacked the firm. You are going to federal prison for this. Call me back before I call the authorities. I gently patted my daughter's back, feeling her steady, rhythmic breathing against my chest. Julian genuinely believed I was a criminal. He believed I had acted out of hysterical, scorned woman vengeance, smashing the system from the outside. He lacked the intellectual capacity to understand that I did not need to hack the system. I built the system. I picked up my phone to send my first and only response. I did not type out an argument. I did not engage with his threats. I simply opened my secure file vault and extracted a specific PDF document. It was the operational restructuring agreement from 3 years ago. At the time, Beatrice and Julian were facing a massive audit from the Internal Revenue Service due to their own sloppy, negligent bookkeeping. They had begged me to fix it. I saved them from federal indictment, but as a condition of my continued employment as chief financial officer, I drafted a new corporate charter. Julian and Beatrice had signed it without reading the fine print, far too relieved by their salvation to care about the mechanics of it. I took a screenshot of page 42, highlighting Clause 4B. The clause clearly stated that the chief financial officer was granted unilateral fiduciary control, including the absolute right to freeze, liquidate, or restructure any and all corporate assets without secondary executive approval in the event of gross executive negligence that jeopardized the financial stability or legal standing of the firm. Underneath the screenshot, I typed a single sentence. Using corporate operating funds to lease a luxury penthouse for a junior analyst is the textbook legal definition of gross executive negligence and introduces catastrophic sexual harassment liability to the firm. I hit send. I watched the read receipt illuminate. I imagined Julian standing in the hollowed-out shell of my former office, staring at his screen as the trap finally snapped shut around his ankles. He had given me the key to the kingdom 3 years ago, and his own reckless infidelity had just handed me the legal justification to lock the gates. I had broken no laws. I had executed my fiduciary duty to protect the company from his catastrophic personal choices. But the financial freeze did not just isolate Julian. The family firm operated as an interconnected web of trust funds, shell companies, and quarterly dividend payouts. By liquidating the primary asset pools and holding them in a secure escrow under my fiduciary control, I had effectively turned off the water supply to the entire family tree. It only took 2 hours for the drought to reach the next branch. My secure phone buzzed again. This time the caller ID did not display Julian's number. It was an unrecognized, heavily encrypted routing number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end. Julian's older brother Malik relied entirely on a massive quarterly trust distribution to fund his lifestyle. Malik was currently unemployed, masquerading as a venture capitalist while quietly burning through the family fortune. More specifically, his wife Harper relied on those distributions. Harper was a woman who wore her entitlement like a suit of armor. She was white, born into a minor political family, and had always treated my presence in the family with thinly veiled disdain. To Harper, I was the hired help who had somehow managed to trick Julian into putting a ring on my finger. She was polite at holiday dinners, but her smiles never reached her eyes, and her compliments were always loaded with condescension. I accepted the call, putting the phone on speaker and setting it back on the glass table. Zora Harper screamed, her voice shrill and completely devoid of her usual country club restraint. "What exactly do you think you are doing? Malik just tried to authorize a wire transfer for our yacht club fees, and the bank told him the trust routing numbers no longer exist. Malik is at the bank right now and they are treating him like a common criminal. You turn those accounts back on this instant." I leaned back in my chair, sipping my tea, letting her rage echo in the quiet, sunlit room. The true consequences of my departure were finally making landfall, and Harper was about to realize that the hired help had just become the landlord. The encrypted burner phone resting on the tempered glass table of my sunroom began to vibrate with a harsh, rhythmic pulse. The caller identification displayed an unrecognized string of digits, but the routing prefix unmistakably belonged to the exclusive gated community where Julian's older brother Malik resided. More specifically, it belonged to Malik's wife Harper. Harper was a woman who treated her marriage into the family like a royal coronation and treated me like the hired help who had somehow managed to sneak past the service entrance. I pressed the green button, placed the device on speakerphone, and continued reviewing the complex liquidity charts illuminating my primary monitor. "You ghetto thief!" Harper hissed the moment the line connected. The refined country club restraint she usually wore had completely vanished, replaced by the ugly, visceral entitlement that always simmered just beneath her manicured surface. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Malik just tried to authorize a wire transfer to cover our quarterly yacht club fees, and the private wealth manager told him the trust routing numbers no longer exist. "Turn those accounts back on this instant." I remained completely silent, idly tapping my digital stylus against my tablet. My lack of a reaction only fueled her escalating rage. "We know exactly what you did," Harper continued, her voice shrill and echoing through my quiet, temperature-controlled sanctuary. Julian called Beatrice in absolute tears. "You actually thought you could hack into the family mainframe and hold our money hostage just because your husband decided to upgrade to a younger, prettier model. You are pathetic, Zora. You are a bitter, jealous woman who could not handle the fact that you were never truly one of us. You manipulated the book, stole our capital out of pure spite, and ran away like a common criminal." "Are you finished?" I asked. My voice was perfectly flat, completely devoid of the hysterical reaction she was desperately fishing for. "I am just getting started." Harper snapped, her breathing heavy with manufactured righteousness. "Beatrice is not just sitting around while you throw your little temper tantrum. She has already dispatched the most expensive private investigators in the Southeast. These are former federal agents, Zora. They are tracking your phone signal. They are tracking your vehicle registration. They are going to find you. They are going to take those twins back to their rightful home. And then Beatrice is handing you over directly to the district attorney. You are going to be arrested for grand larceny. I hope you look good in an orange jumpsuit because you are going to federal prison." I allowed a full 5 seconds of absolute silence to pass over the line. I wanted the weight of her empty, uneducated threats to hang in the air, completely unsupported by any actual legal leverage. While she had been ranting, my fingers had been moving across my keyboard. I had already opened a specific, heavily encrypted folder on my secondary monitor. It was labeled with the name of the high-profile youth charity gala Harper had chaired the previous winter. "Harper," I said smoothly, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair, "I am sending an email to your personal account right now. I suggest you open it immediately. I am not looking at whatever fabricated garbage you—" "Open it," I commanded, projecting the sharp, authoritative tone I usually reserved for hostile corporate board meetings. I heard the faint clicking of a mouse through the speakerphone. A moment later, I heard her sharp intake of breath. "What is this?" she whispered, the venom instantly draining from her voice, replaced by a sudden, icy confusion. "That is a forensic audit." I explained, my eyes scanning the very same document on my screen. I conducted it 6 months ago when I noticed severe discrepancies in the philanthropic ledger. "You see, Harper, you are incredibly careless. You assumed that because Beatrice loves the positive press your little charity galas generate, no one would actually audit the vendor invoices or cross-reference the tax identification numbers." I heard nothing but shallow, rapid breathing on the other end of the line. I pressed the advantage, laying out the data with ruthless mathematical precision. "Page 4. Paragraph 2. I instructed calmly. "You build the family trust for premium catering services, exotic floral arrangements, and structural event staging. However, the vendors listed on those invoices do not exist. They are ghost entities registered to a vacant post office box in Delaware. The routing numbers for those payments did not go to event planners or florists. They went directly to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. An account that coincidentally mirrors the exact payout structure utilized by the underground sports betting syndicate your husband frequents." "You have no proof," Harper stammered, her voice shaking violently. "You cannot prove Malik's gambling debts have anything to do with my charity work." "I am a forensic accountant," I reminded her, keeping my tone lethally calm. "My entire career is built on proving the origin and destination of invisible money. You skimmed exactly $400,000 from a youth community fund to pay off your husband's illicit gambling debts, just so the syndicate would not break his kneecaps. I have the wire transfer receipts. I have the IP addresses you used to authorize the payments from your home network. I have the digital signature you forged to bypass the secondary approval process." "Zora, please," Harper gasped. The arrogance was completely eradicated, replaced by naked, suffocating panic. "You called me a thief." I continued, my voice dropping to a low, rhythmic cadence. "You accused me of hacking the firm out of jealousy. Let me be perfectly clear. I did not hack anything. I am the legally appointed Chief Financial Officer of the family trust. I restructured the assets 90 days ago when I found Julian's burner phone hidden in his golf bag. I executed my legal fiduciary duty to protect the corporate entity from executives who were compromising its financial integrity. I locked the accounts through entirely legal channels. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the reality of her situation crush whatever fight she had left. You, however, committed charity embezzlement and federal wire fraud, I stated. So please, Harper, call the FBI. Send the private investigators to my door. I would absolutely love to invite federal agents into my home, sit them down at my desk, and walk them through your tax returns line by line. I wonder how Beatrice will react when she realizes her flawless upper-crust daughter-in-law is the reason the family name is plastered across federal indictments. There was no response. The only sound was a faint, choked sob before the line went dead. Harper had hung up. She was neutralized. She would not be calling the authorities, and she would spend the rest of the day terrified of her own shadow. I placed the burner phone back on the table, one pawn removed from the board, but Beatrice was not Harper. Beatrice was the queen, and she was far more dangerous because she operated entirely on pride, spite, and a deeply ingrained belief that the rules did not apply to her. I turned my attention back to the primary financial dashboard. I had set up automated security alerts for any activity related to Beatrice's personal assets. I watched the screen as several small, desperate alerts popped up in real time. Beatrice was attempting to secure liquid cash. She was trying to borrow against her vintage car collection. Denied. She tried to leverage the equity on her sprawling summer estate in the Hamptons. Denied. I had legally cross-collateralized all of their personal luxury assets against the firm's commercial debt prior to my departure. They owned absolutely nothing outright. Every single asset was tied to the corporate structure I now controlled. Cornered animals are entirely unpredictable. Beatrice realized she could not access her money, and she knew she could not use the local police without exposing the family's internal financial rot to public scrutiny. She needed a different angle of attack. She needed to destroy my ability to operate. She needed to cut off my oxygen. If she could not touch my bank accounts, she would target the very foundation of my corporate power. She would target my professional credentials. Beatrice had spent 3 decades cultivating deep, corrupt political connections throughout the state. She hosted lavish fundraisers for senators, secretly funded judicial campaigns through dark money channels, and sat on the advisory boards of major regulatory agencies. She wielded her social influence like a blunt instrument, crushing anyone who dared to challenge her authority. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, an urgent notification chimed on my secure laptop. It was an automated email from the State Board of Accountancy. The subject line was flagged in bright red, high-priority text. I opened the message. It was a formal, legally binding notice of suspension. My certified public accountant license and my specialized forensic accounting credentials had been temporarily frozen effective immediately pending an emergency ethics review board investigation. The notice cited anonymous allegations of gross professional misconduct, financial extortion, and severe breach of fiduciary duty. Beatrice had called in a massive political favor. By freezing my license, she believed she was paralyzing me. In the corporate world, a chief financial officer without a valid active accounting license cannot legally authorize major financial restructuring, cannot interface with federal banking regulators, and cannot represent a firm in any official capacity. She was attempting to strip me of my armor, rendering my legal maneuvers invalid and forcing me to return the assets to her control to avoid professional ruin. She thought she had backed me into an inescapable corner. She thought she had finally found the fatal vulnerability in my fortress. She thought I was just a girl from the South Side playing a high-stakes game I did not fully understand. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The notification arrived precisely at 2:15 in the afternoon. It did not come through a phone call or a dramatic knock at the door. It was a sterile, automated email from the State Board of Accountancy, flagged with a high-priority red banner. I opened the message and read the cold legal text. My certified public accountant license and my specialized forensic accounting credentials had been temporarily suspended effective immediately. The board cited a pending emergency ethics review based on anonymous allegations of gross professional misconduct, financial extortion, and a severe breach of fiduciary duty. Beatrice had finally made her move. I knew she possessed extensive political reach throughout the state of Georgia. She hosted lavish fundraisers for local senators, quietly funneled dark money into judicial campaigns, and sat on the advisory boards of 3 different regulatory agencies. She wielded her social influence like a blunt instrument, crushing anyone who dared to challenge her authority. By freezing my license, she believed she was paralyzing me. In the corporate wealth sector, a chief financial officer without a valid and active accounting license cannot legally authorize major financial restructuring. They cannot interface with federal banking regulators, and they certainly cannot represent a multi-million-dollar firm in any official capacity. She was attempting to strip me of my armor, rendering my legal maneuvers invalid, and forcing me to return the assets to her control to avoid professional ruin. The domino effect was instantaneous. Within 20 minutes of the suspension notice hitting the state database, the automated compliance algorithms at my primary banking institutions triggered a red flag. I watched my personal checking and primary operational accounts flash gray on my monitor. The status updated from active to frozen. The banks were legally obligated to halt all transactions, while my professional credentials were under investigation for financial misconduct. Beatrice had essentially severed my access to the conventional financial grid. My encrypted phone vibrated on the glass desk. A single email had just arrived in my private inbox from Beatrice. The subject line was blank. The body of the message contained exactly 5 words. Checkmate. Bring the children home. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and let out a slow and measured breath. I analyzed Beatrice's mindset with the same detached precision I used to audit fraudulent tax returns. She equated money with oxygen. Because she had lived her entire life entirely dependent on inherited wealth, she believed that cutting off my primary accounts was the equivalent of cutting off my air supply. She fully expected me to panic. She anticipated that within 24 hours, I would be crawling back to her gated estate, completely broken, ready to hand over my newborn twins for a fraction of the original $25 million offer just to survive. She thought she had backed me into an inescapable corner. She thought she had finally found the fatal vulnerability in my fortress. She thought I was just a girl from the South Side, playing a high-stakes game I did not fully understand. She was about to learn a very expensive lesson in structural financial engineering. I did not panic. I did not draft a frantic appeal to the state board. I simply closed the primary banking window on my monitor and opened a secondary, heavily encrypted portal. Beatrice did not understand that I had anticipated this exact scenario the day I married her son. I knew her playbook. I knew how the elite weaponized bureaucracy against those they deemed inferior. I knew that my license was a vulnerability she would eventually target. I did not need a state board to validate my right to operate. I seamlessly initiated the transfer of my operational control to a ghost limited liability company incorporated in Delaware. Delaware is a state known for its impenetrable corporate secrecy laws. The company operated under a proxy name, utilizing a registered agent service that completely shielded the identities of its true owners. There was no public record tying Zora to this entity. More importantly, this corporate vehicle was funded entirely by my personal profit-sharing trust. Over the past 5 years, my financial models had tripled the revenue of my husband's family firm. Every time I saved them from a bad investment or optimized their tax liabilities, a percentage of those recovered funds was legally routed into my vested trust. That money was ironclad. It was insulated from civil litigation, immune to corporate clawbacks, and completely untouched by the state accounting board. With a few keystrokes, I executed the migration. My liquid capital flowed effortlessly through invisible digital pipes, settling into the accounts of the Delaware entity. The beauty of this maneuver lay in its absolute simplicity. I was no longer acting as the chief financial officer managing another family's wealth. I had transformed myself into a private equity entity. A private creditor does not require an active accounting license to operate to hold corporate debt or to initiate a collection on a default. Beatrice thought she had fired the accountant. She had actually just given birth to the firm's most ruthless creditor. While I sat in the quiet comfort of my sunroom, fully operational and heavily capitalized, Julian was experiencing his own catastrophic reality check across town. The financial drought had finally reached his mistress. Jasmine was not a woman who stayed for love, and she certainly was not a woman who stayed for a man with declined credit cards. I reviewed the digital transaction logs I still monitored. Jasmine had attempted to use Julian to maintain the illusion of their glamorous affair. She wanted the luxury penthouse. She wanted the Michelin-starred dinners. But Julian could provide nothing. His corporate black card was suspended. His personal accounts were drained. His family trust was locked behind the iron gates of my fiduciary restructuring. The truth crashed down on Jasmine with brutal clarity. Julian was financially neutered. He had absolutely zero access to the wealth that made him attractive. He was just a middle-aged man in a tailored suit with a cheating habit and an empty wallet. Jasmine did not just leave quietly. The logs showed her attempting to charge a first-class one-way ticket to Los Angeles on his secondary account. When that failed, the argument must have been spectacular. Julian had built his entire identity around being the provider, the wealthy heir who could buy loyalty and affection. Watching Jasmine dial a private car service on her own phone, completely discarding him the moment his utility expired, must have shattered whatever delusions he still held about their romance. Jasmine abandoned ship immediately. She packed her bags and left Julian standing in his expensive and hollowed-out life. He had traded his family, his children, and his future for a woman who vanished the second the funding dried up. The rain started falling heavily over the Georgia pines just as the sun began to set. It was a torrential and unyielding downpour that turned the sky a bruised and stormy purple. I was reviewing the final incorporation documents for my Delaware proxy when a soft melodic chime echoed through my smart home system. It was a security perimeter alert. Motion had been detected at the primary iron gate at the entrance of my hidden estate. I pulled up the high-definition night vision feed on my central monitor. The camera angle provided a clear and unobstructed view of the reinforced steel barrier separating my property from the winding private access road. The rain was coming down in thick gray sheets, splashing violently against the pavement. Standing there in the center of the camera frame completely alone was Julian. He had no umbrella. There was no luxury sports car idling behind him. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive Italian suit plastered to his skin, his hair plastered to his forehead. The arrogance that usually defined his every movement had been completely stripped away, washed down the storm drains along with his mother's money. I watched his miserable figure on the monitor. A part of me, the woman who had stood at an altar with him 5 years ago, felt a brief and microscopic pang of pity. But the forensic accountant in me simply recognized a liability that had been successfully excised from the balance sheet. He reached out with a trembling hand and pressed the intercom button. He looked up directly into the camera lens, his face pale and drawn, looking exactly like a man who had finally realized he was standing on the wrong side of the fortress walls. The heavy wrought iron gate stood resolute against the torrential Georgia rain, a towering black barricade separating my sanctuary from the storm. On my high-definition monitor, Julian was a pathetic sight. The man who had strutted into my hospital suite just days prior with his mistress and his mother demanding my absolute surrender was now entirely undone by the sudden absence of his inherited leverage. His custom-tailored suit, a fabric completely unsuited for extreme weather, clung to his shivering frame. His hair was plastered across his forehead, and rainwater streamed down his face, masking whatever tears he might have been shedding. I pressed the intercom button on my console, activating the two-way audio feed. The speaker crackled to life, picking up the heavy drumming of the rain against the pavement. Zora Julian gasped his voice instantly, recognizing the subtle electronic hum of an open channel. "Zora, please tell me you are listening." I said nothing. I simply watched him. He dropped to his knees right there on the slick black asphalt. The impact must have bruised him, but he did not seem to care. He gripped the iron bars of the gate with both hands, pressing his face against the cold metal. "She left me." He choked out the words, tumbling over each other in a desperate, ragged rush. Jasmine left. The second my cards declined at the broker's office, her entire demeanor changed. She did not even ride back to the office with me. She ordered a private car and told me not to contact her again. She said I was useless to her without the firm's backing. I was a fool, Zora. I was an absolute fool. I see that now. Please, you have to let me in. We can fix this. You can reverse the asset freeze. We can go back to how things were. The audacity of his request hung in the quiet air of my sunroom. He genuinely believed that the destruction of our marriage, the public humiliation in the maternity ward, and the attempt to steal my newborn children could simply be undone, because the woman he abandoned me for had abandoned him. I am so sorry, Julian sobbed, pressing his forehead against the iron. I just want to come home. I want to see my son and my daughter. Please, Zora, they are my children too. Do not keep a father from his babies. I leaned closer to the microphone. My voice when I finally spoke was calm, measured, and completely devoid of warmth. It sliced through the sound of the rain with surgical precision. You do not miss me, Julian, I said softly. You miss your comfort. You miss your unlimited credit limit. You miss the invisible shield that protected you from the consequences of your own mediocrity. Zora. No, he pleaded, shaking the heavy gate. That is not true. I love you. I have always loved you. You loved my utility, I corrected him, refusing to let his manufactured emotion derail the absolute truth of our history. 5 years ago, your mother was facing 3 counts of federal tax evasion. The Internal Revenue Service was preparing to seize the estate and dismantle the firm. You spent your nights drinking at the country club, paralyzed by the thought of actually having to work for a living. I was the one who stayed awake for 72 hours straight, restructuring the ledgers, negotiating with federal auditors, and shielding this family from criminal indictment. You loved that I was competent enough to handle the burdens you were too weak to carry. You loved that I fixed the plumbing so you could keep sailing your yacht. But you never loved me. The moment you felt secure again, you brought a junior analyst into our bed. The accuracy of my words struck a nerve. The desperation in Julian's posture hardened. He pulled himself up from his knees, his hands tightening into fists around the iron bars. The entitled heir, so accustomed to having his demands met, began to resurface. "Open the damn gate, Zora," he yelled, his voice echoing over the intercom. "You cannot just lock me out of my own life. You are holding my money hostage. You are holding my children hostage. Open this gate right now or I will tear it down myself." He punctuated his demand by slamming his fists against the metal, a futile and hollow gesture that barely registered on the reinforced steel. I reached into the drawer of my desk and retrieved a thick, sealed manila envelope. I had prepared this specific document packet weeks in advance, waiting for the precise moment when Julian would inevitably try to play the victim. I picked up my umbrella, stepped out of the sunroom, and walked the 70 yards down the paved driveway toward the front gate. Julian stopped banging on the bars as he saw me approach. He pressed himself against the gate, hope flaring in his eyes as he mistook my proximity for capitulation. "Zora." He breathed heavily, trying to smooth his ruined hair. "Thank God. Let me in. Let me get out of the rain and we can negotiate." I stopped 3 feet from the gate, perfectly shielded by my large black umbrella. I did not reach for the keypad. Instead, I knelt slightly and slid the manila envelope through the narrow gap between the pavement and the bottom of the iron gate. "Read it," I commanded. Julian stared at the damp package at his feet, then looked up at me in confusion. "Just open the gate. Read the file, Julian." I repeated my tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. He slowly reached down and picked up the envelope. He tore the top open with shaking wet fingers and pulled out the thick stack of documents inside. I watched his eyes scan the first page. It was a comprehensive, highly classified background dossier on Jasmine. "She told you she was a recent business school graduate from a modest background," I explained, raising my voice slightly to carry over the heavy rain. "She told you she was hungry to learn the wealth management industry. She played the naive, eager subordinate perfectly." Julian flipped to the second page, his eyes darting frantically across the text. "Jasmine was not a junior analyst," Julian the First continued. She is a highly compensated corporate espionage operative. She has been on the payroll of Vanguard Equities for the last 4 years. Vanguard Equities was Beatrice's most ruthless competitor. The two firms had been engaged in a bitter cutthroat rivalry for over a decade, battling for the same ultra-high net worth clients and institutional investment accounts. Vanguard had always lagged slightly behind, unable to match the consistent market-beating returns generated by our firm. Julian's hands began to shake violently as he turned to the third page of the dossier. It contained a series of time-stamped photographs, digital access logs, and encrypted email transcripts. "You wanted to impress her," I said, the final pieces of the puzzle sliding into place. "You wanted to show this beautiful younger woman how powerful and intelligent you were. You wanted to prove that you were the mastermind behind the family wealth, not your mother, and certainly not your wife. So during one of your weekend hotel retreats, you logged into the administrative terminal on your phone to show off." Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You showed her the architecture of the firm's proprietary trading algorithm," I stated. "The algorithm I built. The specific sequence of automated market maneuvers that generates 80% of this family's capital. You bragged about how it worked. You let her take pictures of the screen. You literally handed the crown jewels of your mother's empire to a Vanguard operative in bed." He dropped the papers. They scattered across the wet asphalt, the ink beginning to run as the rain beat down on them. Vanguard now possessed the exact mathematical formula that made Julian's family wealthy. Within weeks, they would reverse engineer it, deploy it, and render the family firm completely obsolete. "I did not hack the accounts to punish you for an affair, Julian," I said, stepping back from the gate. "I restructured the assets and isolated the capital because you committed an act of catastrophic corporate treason. You did not just lose your marriage, you destroyed your family's legacy." Julian looked at the scattered papers, then looked up at me. The realization of what he had actually done finally hit him. It was a crushing physical blow. He did not scream, he did not argue. His knees simply gave out and he collapsed onto the pavement, curling forward into the driving rain, a broken man who had single-handedly orchestrated his own total annihilation. I turned my back on him and walked slowly up the driveway, the sound of his ragged sobbing fading behind me. When I re-entered the house and returned to the sunroom, my secure tablet was flashing with a new urgent notification. The digital alarm was not tied to banking infrastructure or corporate assets. It was a legal alert directly from the Fulton County Family Court Registry. Beatrice was bleeding out financially, and she knew it. She knew she could not beat me in a boardroom, and she knew her corrupt accounting board maneuver had failed to force my hand. Desperation breeds extreme measures. I opened the court filing. Beatrice had just bypassed all standard legal protocols to file an ex parte emergency custody order. She had gone directly to a judge she had heavily funded in the last election cycle, demanding an immediate unannounced police raid on my location. The official sworn affidavit bore her signature. She was not claiming I was an unfit mother. She was claiming I was a dangerous, unstable flight risk who had legally kidnapped her grandchildren. The order demanded that armed law enforcement officers retrieve the twins immediately and deliver them to Beatrice's custody. The war for the money was over, but the war for my children had just begun. The torrential downpour that had soaked Julian to the bone finally began to subside, leaving behind a thick, suffocating Georgia humidity that clung to the windows of my sunroom. Julian had eventually surrendered to his own misery, stumbling away from my gate and disappearing into the dark. I knew his retreat was only temporary. He was a coward, but his mother was a predator. I sat at my central monitoring station, a fresh cup of tea resting on the glass desk, waiting for her next maneuver. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 10:42 in the evening, the perimeter alarms of my estate triggered a cascading sequence of silent alerts across my screens. The flashing blue and red strobes of law enforcement vehicles sliced through the lingering fog, illuminating the dense pines lining my private road. Through the high-definition security feed, I watched a convoy of 3 Fulton County Sheriff cruisers and 2 sleek black civilian SUVs park at aggressive tactical angles across my property line. They had bypassed the outer community gate. My private, heavily armed security contractors allowed them entry onto the main driveway solely because they were accompanied by uniformed deputies, but my men immediately formed a tight, unyielding physical perimeter across the front steps of the estate. The heavy doors of the lead black SUV swung open. Out stepped Vance Sterling. Vance was Beatrice's primary attack dog, an obscenely expensive litigator who specialized in making the legal problems of the ultra-wealthy disappear through a combination of brutal intimidation and corrupt court filings. He wore a tailored waterproof trench coat that looked completely out of place in the muggy night air. In his left hand, he casually carried a pristine leather-trimmed infant car seat. The sheer audacity of the prop sent a cold, calculated spike of adrenaline through my veins. Two deputies flanked him, their expressions tense and uncomfortable as they approached my security line. I smoothed the fabric of my silk blouse, verified the location of the document in my pocket, and walked to the front entrance. I opened the heavy double doors and stepped out onto the covered porch, looking down at the raiding party assembled on my driveway. Vance offered a predatory, thoroughly rehearsed smile. It was the expression of a man who believed he held absolute power. "Good evening, Zora," he said smoothly, stopping at the bottom stair, exactly 1 inch outside the reach of my security detail. "We are here to execute a lawful binding order signed less than an hour ago by a Fulton County magistrate. You have been deemed an immediate flight risk and a severe danger to the minor children residing in this home. The court has granted your mother-in-law, Beatrice Wilson, full temporary emergency custody." He lifted the empty infant car seat, holding it up into the glare of the security floodlights like a trophy of war. "You have exactly 5 minutes to go inside, pack a single diaper bag, and hand over the babies. If you delay, if you attempt to barricade yourself inside this fortress, or if you instruct your private mercenaries to interfere with this lawful retrieval, these deputies will arrest you for obstruction of justice and child endangerment. You will spend tonight in a concrete holding cell, and Beatrice will still be taking the children home. Do not make this a tragedy, Zora." Any normal mother would have shattered in that moment. Any normal mother would have collapsed to the pavement, screaming, begging, or physically throwing herself at the officers to protect the fragile 2-day-old infants sleeping peacefully in their nursery just down the hall. But I was not a normal mother. I was a forensic accountant who had spent half a decade managing the toxic radioactive liabilities of a corrupt financial dynasty. I did not operate on maternal panic. I operated on leverage. I looked past Vance's smug face and addressed the lead deputy, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair whose posture screamed reluctance. "Deputy," I said, clearly, my voice projecting with absolute authority over the low hum of the idling police cruisers. "I highly advise you to physically review the documentation Mr. Sterling is using to justify this home invasion. I guarantee you he has deliberately omitted a critical jurisdictional fact to manipulate your department." Vance scoffed, taking an aggressive step forward. "Do not listen to a word she says. She is stalling. Execute the warrant and secure the premises." I reached into the pocket of my slacks and retrieved a thick, blue-backed legal document. I handed it to the head of my security detail, who stepped down and pressed it firmly against the chest of the lead deputy. That, I explained as the deputy unfolded the heavy embossed paper, is a federal injunction issued by the United States District Court. It was signed, sealed, and entered into the Federal Registry exactly 1 week ago. Vance froze. The arrogant smile was instantly wiped from his face, replaced by a sudden rigid apprehension. Federal injunctions did not simply materialize out of thin air to counter local family court disputes. I continued speaking directly to the deputy, treating Vance like a ghost. When I discovered the staggering extent of my husband's corporate espionage and his mother's offshore financial fraud, I knew they would eventually attempt to weaponize local law enforcement to intimidate me. They own half the magistrates in this county, so I completely bypassed the local jurisdiction. Last week, I initiated a formal, highly classified whistleblower protocol with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The deputy was reading the document rapidly, his eyes widening as he scanned the federal seals, the judicial signatures, and the heavily redacted case numbers. Because my newborn twins are listed as secondary beneficiaries on the family trusts that I have legally frozen. I stated, my voice echoing off the brick facade of my home. Those children are now classified as material subjects in an active sealed federal investigation regarding international wire fraud and corporate espionage. The document you are holding clearly dictates that any alteration to the children's custody status, living arrangements, or physical location requires the direct written authorization of a federal judge. I finally shifted my gaze to Vance. All the blood had drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a live landmine. "Your local ex parte order is legally useless paper, Vance," I said softly, delivering the killing blow. "Federal jurisdiction supersedes county family court. If these deputies attempt to remove my children from this premises, they will be actively interfering with an ongoing federal investigation. They will be committing a federal crime. And unlike Beatrice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not care about your golf handicaps or your country club memberships." The lead deputy handed the injunction back to my security chief with hands that were visibly shaking. He turned to Vance, his face flushed with sudden hot anger. "You lied to us, counselor. You swore on record this was a standard domestic retrieval. You failed to mention an active federal hold," Vance stammered, raising his hands defensively, his polished composure completely shattered. "Deputy, this is a fabrication. She is manipulating the system to hold the children hostage. The local judge gave a direct, lawful order." "We are not touching this," the deputy barked, stepping backward and signaling to his partner to stand down immediately. "Take it up with the federal courts. We are leaving." The officers turned on their heels and marched rapidly back to their cruisers. The flashing lights were extinguished, plunging the driveway back into the stark, unforgiving glare of my security lamps. Vance was left standing completely alone at the bottom of my stairs, still awkwardly clutching the empty infant car seat. The absolute crushing humiliation of his defeat radiated from him in waves. He dropped the car seat onto the wet pavement, his hands trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and professional terror. I watched him pull his phone from his trench coat pocket. He did not retreat to the safety of his SUV. He dialed a number right there in the damp night air. Even from 30 feet away, I could hear the tinny, high-pitched shrieking coming through the earpiece. It was Beatrice. She was screaming with such raw, unhinged fury that the audio distorted into static. Vance tried frantically to interrupt her tirade. "Beatrice, you need to listen to me. The local order is dead. She boxed us out. She triggered a federal whistleblower protocol on the trust funds. The feds have a jurisdictional lock on the kids. The police just walked away. We cannot legally touch her tonight." The shrieking on the other end of the line intensified a sound of pure, unadulterated madness. Beatrice was bleeding out financially, her corporate legacy was in ruins, and her ultimate trump card had just been effortlessly swatted away. She was backed into a corner, stripped of her immediate power. But Beatrice Wilson did not possess the psychological capacity to surrender. She doubled down. Vance held the phone away from his ear, wincing visibly. "Yes, Beatrice, I understand. Yes, I have the draft ready. I can file the motion tonight." He put the phone back to his ear, his voice tight, compliant, and laced with dread. "I will file for an emergency expedited hearing tomorrow morning. We will bypass the standard administrative docket entirely. Yes, I will request him specifically." Vance hung up the phone and slowly looked up at me. He looked utterly exhausted, but a new, desperate kind of confidence had settled over his features. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You think you are a genius, Zora. You think federal paper makes you untouchable in this state. We will see exactly how clever you are tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Beatrice just ordered me to secure a mandatory emergency hearing in family court." He turned and walked toward his SUV, throwing his final desperate threat over his shoulder as he opened the door. "We are bypassing the system. We are going straight to Judge Marcus Carter. You are going to lose those kids, Zora." The black SUVs reversed aggressively down the driveway, their tires spinning and screeching on the wet asphalt as they sped away into the darkness. I stood on the porch watching their taillights disappear until the only sound left was the dripping of rainwater from the gutters. I did not go back inside immediately. The heavy air clung to my skin as I processed the name Vance had just weaponized against me. Judge Marcus Carter. I knew exactly who he was. Every wealthy family, every corporate litigator, and every political operative in Atlanta knew who he was. Beatrice had publicly boasted at numerous high society luncheons that she had personally bankrolled Carter's re-election campaign through a highly sophisticated, untraceable network of political action committees. She claimed with terrifying, unchecked arrogance that she kept the man permanently resting in her pocket. He was notorious for delivering swift, brutal, and legally questionable rulings in favor of the elite, completely disregarding standard legal precedents, federal guidelines, and human decency when the price was right. Beatrice was dragging the war out of the shadows and into a courtroom she fully believed she owned. She thought the fix was already in. She thought the gavel was already coming down on my neck. I turned and walked back into my house, the heavy security door locking automatically behind me. I walked straight past the nursery, straight back to my sunroom, woke up my primary monitor, and began pulling the compiled financial data from my Delaware Ghost, LLC. If Beatrice wanted to drag me in front of a heavily corrupted judge, I would not just bring a legal defense. I would bring a total execution. The Fulton County Family Courthouse possessed a heavy, suffocating atmosphere smelling faintly of lemon polish and desperation. I walked through the double oak doors of courtroom 4B at exactly 8:55 in the morning, carrying nothing but a single heavy leather briefcase. I sat alone at the defense table. I did not bring a lawyer. When you hold all the cards, paying someone else to lay them on the table is simply a waste of capital. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's table looked like a corporate war room. Vance Sterling stood at the center, flanked by three anxious junior associates, furiously tapping on tablets. Beatrice sat to his right, dressed in a conservative, unadorned navy suit. She had deliberately removed her trademark South Sea pearls and diamond tennis bracelets, opting for the visual aesthetic of a humble, deeply concerned grandmother. Julian sat to her left, his eyes bloodshot and his posture slumped. He looked entirely medicated, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. High above us all sat Judge Marcus Carter. He possessed the polished, silver-haired look of a man perfectly accustomed to having his authority go unquestioned. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands, offering Vance Sterling the floor with a deferential nod. Vance did not disappoint his employer. He launched into a masterful, deeply dramatic monologue that belonged on a theater stage. He painted a terrifying picture of a woman suffering from a catastrophic, undiagnosed postpartum psychotic break. According to Vance, the stress of childbirth had shattered my fragile mental state. I had hallucinated a non-existent affair between my devoted husband and a junior coworker. Driven by paranoid jealousy, I had utilized my financial expertise to maliciously hack into my husband's corporate accounts, holding his legitimate wealth hostage. Vance's voice trembled with manufactured emotion as he reached his climax. He claimed I had kidnapped my own newborn infants, barricaded myself inside a heavily armed fortress, and was actively preparing to flee the country. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me, demanding the court immediately intervene before my erratic vengeance resulted in physical harm to the children. Judge Carter absorbed every word with practiced, solemn sympathy. He shook his head slowly, looking down at me with an expression of profound theatrical pity. He already had the temporary custody transfer documents resting on his blotter. His gold fountain pen was uncapped, gripped loosely between his fingers, hovering just inches above the signature line. "Mrs. Wilson," Judge Carter began, his voice dripping with heavy paternalistic condescension. "This court takes maternal mental health very seriously. We recognize the profound physiological toll childbirth can take on a woman. However, the evidence of your erratic, vindictive, and deeply unstable behavior presented here today is absolutely overwhelming. You have financially ruined your husband and isolated your children from their loving family." He paused, letting the silence hang in the large room to emphasize his authority. "Do you have any character witnesses?" Carter asked, a mocking edge creeping into his tone. "A psychiatrist, perhaps, a medical professional, or a family member who can stand before this court and dispute these extremely disturbing claims." Because unless you can produce overwhelming evidence to contradict Mr. Sterling's timeline, I am going to sign this emergency order and dispatch federal marshals to retrieve those infants for their own safety. I glanced across the aisle. Beatrice was looking directly at me. The facade of the humble grandmother vanished for a fraction of a second. She smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly triumphant smirk. She believed she had won. She believed the game was over. The board was cleared and she had successfully leveraged her bought and paid for judge to legally steal my children. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. The heavy oak chair scraped slightly against the floor. I picked up my leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks open, and retrieved a massive 500-page bound document. It was thick, heavy, and meticulously tabbed with red and yellow markers. I do not require a character witness, Your Honor, I stated clearly, my voice projecting across the silent courtroom without a single tremor. My character is not the one putting my children at risk. The only character relevant to the safety of my infants is the woman sitting at the plaintiff's table. Placing my newborns in the custody of Beatrice Wilson would subject them to immediate catastrophic endangerment, as she is currently the primary target of an active, highly classified federal investigation. Vance Sterling jumped to his feet, his chair nearly toppling over. Objection! Your Honor, this is exactly the paranoid delusion we described. She is inventing federal investigations to distract from her own criminal behavior. Judge Carter raised his hand, gesturing for Vance to lower his voice, though Carter's eyes had narrowed defensively. Mrs. Wilson, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. This court does not tolerate baseless slander. I stepped out from behind the defense table and walked directly to the bench. I placed the massive binder on the elevated wood surface, sliding it directly in front of the judge. That is Exhibit A, Your Honor, I said. It is not a delusion. It is a forensic financial ledger I compiled and submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation 48 hours ago. It details exactly how Beatrice Wilson has been systematically embezzling corporate funds to operate an illegal offshore shadow economy. Beatrice stiffened in her chair. Julian finally looked up, his jaw dropping. I continued speaking, ensuring every word carried absolute, undeniable weight. Beatrice Wilson uses a Delaware proxy corporation known as Apex Holdings, Vanguard Equities. A corporate rival funnels capital into Apex in exchange for stolen proprietary trading algorithms provided by her son Julian. Beatrice then uses Apex Holdings to launder that money through various political action committees. I took a step closer to the bench, locking eyes with Judge Carter. Specifically, Your Honor, I direct your attention to page 412 of that ledger, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. Page 412 details how Apex Holdings is the primary financial backer of your current judicial re-election campaign. You have personally accepted over $800,000 in illegal laundered corporate funds from the woman sitting at the plaintiff's table. The air in the courtroom instantly evaporated. The silence was so absolute, so heavy, it felt like the atmospheric pressure had suddenly shifted. I did not just freeze their assets, Judge Carter, I concluded. I traced the money, every single dollar, and the paper trail leads directly to your campaign headquarters. If you sign that custody order today, you are legally binding yourself to a federal target on the exact same day the FBI begins issuing subpoenas for your financial records. Judge Carter looked down at the open ledger. His eyes locked onto page 412. I had highlighted his name, the dates of the wire transfers, and the exact offshore routing numbers in bright yellow ink. The color completely drained from his face. His skin turned a sickening ashen gray. His hand began to shake so violently that the gold fountain pen slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against the mahogany bench. He looked at me, then looked past me to Beatrice. He realized in a fraction of a second that Beatrice had not sent him a routine family dispute. She had unknowingly handed him a live grenade. Carter did not look at Vance. He did not ask for a recess. He simply backed his chair away from the bench as if the ledger itself were radioactive. Due to an unforeseen and immediately apparent conflict of interest, Carter stammered, his voice breathless and cracking with sheer panic. I am recusing myself from this case effective immediately. This hearing is adjourned. All emergency motions are denied pending review by a newly assigned independent magistrate. He slammed his gavel down once, missing the sound block entirely and hitting the desk. He practically bolted from the bench, disappearing through the heavy wooden doors to his private chambers before Vance could even utter a single syllable of protest. He had thrown Beatrice directly to the wolves to save his own skin. The courtroom erupted, the refined Southern matriarch facade completely shattered. Beatrice snapped. She lunged forward, knocking her chair backward onto the floor. She slammed her hands onto the plaintiff's table, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. "You miserable, lying thief!" Beatrice screamed, the sound tearing through her vocal cords. Her voice was guttural and frantic, entirely devoid of her usual polished grace. "I will destroy you. I will have you ruined. You will never see those children again." She attempted to charge across the aisle toward me. Two armed court bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing her by the arms and physically restraining her. She fought them, thrashing wildly, her designer heels slipping on the polished floor. Julian cowered in his seat, completely paralyzed by the sight of his invincible mother unraveling in public. Vance Sterling was frantically shoving his tablet into his briefcase, desperately trying to distance himself from the radioactive wreckage of the Wilson family. As the bailiffs dragged Beatrice backward toward the exit, she stopped fighting the officers and locked her furious wide eyes on Vance. If she could not use the legal system, she would burn the ground I walked on. "Vance!" She shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings as she was pulled through the doors. "Call them! Call Channel 4! Call every reporter in the city!" The heavy doors swung shut, cutting off her screams. I stood alone in the center of the quiet courtroom, packing my ledger back into my briefcase. The legal battle had been won, but my phone in my pocket was already vibrating. The press was about to descend, and the court of public opinion was a completely different kind of war. The morning after Judge Carter's spectacular implosion in the courtroom, Beatrice executed her Promise Scorched Earth campaign. She could not touch me legally, and she could not access her frozen capital, so she leveraged the only currency she had left in abundance. She weaponized her social capital. By dawn, the narrative had been meticulously engineered and deployed. The Atlanta Executive Ledger, a prominent financial journal whose publisher frequently occupied the VIP booth at Beatrice's charity galas, dropped a digital exclusive that quickly cascaded across every major news network in the state. I sat at my desk with my morning tea, calmly reading the headline plastered across my monitor. It did not mention the federal investigation, the offshore tax havens, or the fact that a sitting judge had just recused himself to dodge an FBI subpoena. Instead, the article painted a tragic, deeply sympathetic portrait of the Wilson family, framing them as the victims of a mentally fractured and vindictive daughter-in-law. According to the heavily fabricated article, I was a disgruntled former employee who had suffered a catastrophic postpartum psychotic break. Beatrice had provided exclusive quotes from unnamed concerned family friends detailing my supposed erratic behavior and history of paranoia. The piece claimed that in a delusional state of unwarranted jealousy over my husband's innocent professional relationships, I had exploited my position as chief financial officer to embezzle millions of dollars from the family trust. To finalize the character assassination, the article stated that I had essentially kidnapped the newborn heirs to the Wilson dynasty, barricading myself in an undisclosed location while I prepared to flee the jurisdiction. The real-world consequences of the publication hit my property line almost instantly. By 8 in the morning, a swarm of satellite news vans, aggressive local reporters, and freelance paparazzi had completely choked the entrance to my private road. I pulled up the security camera feeds and watched the chaos unfold. Flashing strobes illuminated the dense Georgia pines as reporters shoved microphones through the wrought iron bars of my gate. My private security contractors had to form a physical barricade, standing shoulder to shoulder in their tactical gear, to keep the more ambitious journalists from attempting to scale the masonry walls. My encrypted phone began to light up with notifications, but they were not messages of support. The corporate world is exceptionally fickle, and proximity to a scandal is a highly contagious disease. I watched as former colleagues from the financial district actively distanced themselves. Women I had personally mentored blocked my professional profiles. Board members I had advised for years ignored my emails. My professional network was evaporating in real time. Beatrice knew exactly what she was doing. She was systematically destroying my reputation, hoping the sheer weight of public humiliation and professional exile would shatter my resolve. She expected me to panic. She anticipated that I would hire an overpriced crisis management firm issue a frantic and tearful press release, or beg her for a quiet settlement. She wanted me to capitulate to trade the frozen assets and my children for a retraction of the smear campaign. She wanted me to surrender so I could salvage whatever was left of my name. I did none of those things. I sat in my sunlit office, watched the media circus outside my gates on a high-definition monitor, and did absolutely nothing. A standard crisis management protocol dictates immediate aggressive denial. You fight the narrative to control the damage. But I was not playing a standard game of public relations, and I certainly did not care what the Atlanta high society thought of my mental state. I let the article run rampant. I allowed the digital links to be shared thousands of times across every financial networking platform. Beatrice was so blinded by her desire to destroy me socially that she failed to realize the catastrophic financial signal she had just broadcast to the world. By publicly claiming that her firm's chief financial officer had successfully embezzled millions of dollars and compromised the foundational family trust, she had inadvertently announced a massive security breach. Ultra-high net worth individuals do not care about family drama or postpartum depression. They care about volatility, and they absolutely loathe vulnerability. Beatrice had just confirmed to her entire client base that their money was managed by an institution with security protocols weak enough to be bypassed by a single rogue employee. I did not need to draft a warning memo to the investors. Beatrice had just published it for me on the front page of the city's leading business journal. I simply sat back, folded my hands on my desk, and waited for the inevitable panic to set in. The wait was exceptionally brief. The financial markets operate on confidence, and Beatrice had just shattered whatever confidence the Wilson firm had left. At exactly 2:14 in the afternoon, my burner phone vibrated violently against the glass desktop. The caller identification displayed Julian's personal number. I reached out and tapped the speakerphone button, fully expecting a barrage of arrogant gloating. I expected him to brag about the news vans parked at my gate and demand my surrender. Instead, what I heard was the sound of a man watching his entire universe burn to ashes. Zora Julian gasped. His voice was trembling so violently that he could barely form the syllables. He was hyperventilating, struggling to pull air into his lungs. The characteristic arrogance that usually coated his words had been entirely incinerated. I leaned forward. "You sound stressed, Julian. Are the news cameras making it difficult to pull out of your driveway?" "It is not the reporters," he choked out, letting out a sound that was half sob and half scream. "The clients. Zora. The clients are pulling out. All of them." I kept my tone perfectly level. "Well, your mother did just announce to the world that your financial fortress was easily breached. Capital flight is the standard market response to executive incompetence. It is not the article," Zora Julian yelled, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "It is Vanguard." I went completely still. The mention of Beatrice's biggest corporate rival shifted the entire landscape of the conversation. "What about Vanguard?" I asked. "They just held a global press conference." Julian stammered, his words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed rush. "They just launched a revolutionary new automated trading platform. They sent the prospectus to every single client on our primary roster. They are promising guaranteed market-beating returns with lower overhead." I watched the rainfall monitor on my secondary screen, calculating the trajectory of his panic. "Vanguard is always making empty promises, Julian. Why are your clients taking the bait?" "Because it is not an empty promise," Julian cried, his voice dropping into a hollow, devastated whisper. "Zora." I looked at the technical specifications they released to the press. I looked at the mathematical architecture of their new platform. "It is our algorithm. It is the exact proprietary model you built for us. It is the identical code." The silence stretched over the encrypted line, heavy and absolute. Julian had finally reached the terrifying conclusion of his own reckless infidelity. When he brought Jasmine, the junior analyst, into his hotel room to impress her, he had given her unfettered access to the firm's most closely guarded intellectual property. He thought he was seducing an eager subordinate. He had actually handed the crown jewels of his mother's empire directly to a highly trained corporate espionage operative working for Vanguard Equities. They did not just steal the code, Julian continued, openly weeping now. They optimized it for a broader market rollout. They are undercutting our fee structure by 40%. The phones here have not stopped ringing since the press release dropped. Our top-tier investors are initiating emergency capital withdrawals. We are bleeding tens of millions of dollars an hour. The escrow accounts are draining faster than we can process the liquidation paperwork. We are finished, Zora. We are totally wiped out. He was begging for a lifeline, desperate for the woman he had discarded to perform one final miracle and save him from the consequences of his own ego. He wanted me to tell him I had a contingency plan, a hidden firewall that could stop the bleeding. Julian. I said, my voice as cold and dark as deep water. You handed your mother's legacy to a spy because you needed an audience for your vanity. You destroyed your own empire. Do not call this number again. I terminated the call. Julian was financially eradicated, but the war was not entirely over. As the family firm collapsed around her, Beatrice would realize she had nothing left to lose, and a woman with nothing to lose is the most dangerous adversary on the board. The bleeding did not stop. 48 hours after Vanguard Equities launched their automated trading platform utilizing the stolen algorithm, the Wilson family firm experienced a financial hemorrhage of unprecedented proportions. The numbers on my monitors told a story of absolute, unmitigated slaughter. Within 2 days, the firm's total valuation tanked by a staggering 40%. The carefully constructed facade of invulnerability that Beatrice had maintained for decades was evaporating in real time. Institutional investors, hedge fund managers, and old money patriarchs do not tolerate risk, and they certainly do not tolerate incompetence. The moment they realized Vanguard possessed the exact same predictive market architecture, but offered it at a fraction of the management fee, the mass exodus began. The firm's escrow accounts were draining faster than the servers could process the liquidation requests. Beatrice, however, was trapped in a fortress of her own supreme delusion. She had spent her entire life bending reality to her will through intimidation and social leverage, and she simply could not comprehend a scenario where she could not bully her way out of a deficit. Instead of acknowledging the catastrophic security breach caused by her son, she doubled down on her own manufactured narrative. She spent Tuesday morning frantically dialing every major investment banking executive on the Eastern Seaboard, desperately trying to secure a massive commercial bridge loan. She needed immediate liquidity to cover the cascading margin calls and stabilize the firm's hemorrhaging accounts. When the banking executives demanded to know why her top-tier clients were liquidating their portfolios en masse, Beatrice refused to mention Vanguard or the stolen intellectual property. Instead, she blamed me. She claimed the entirely fabricated article she had planted in the Atlanta Executive Ledger had unfortunately spooked conservative investors. She argued that the capital flight was merely a temporary public relations crisis caused by a disgruntled, mentally unstable former employee, and not a fatal structural collapse. The banks, however, employ forensic risk analysts who operate on raw data, not country club gossip. They looked at Vanguard's highly publicized new platform. They looked at the Wilson firm's sudden catastrophic lack of market advantage, and they uniformly declined her loan applications. Beatrice was financially radioactive, and the institutional credit markets had completely shut her out. With external capital entirely cut off, the rot inside the family finally breached the surface. The Wilson dynasty had always been held together by the immense gravitational pull of their wealth. Without it, they were just parasites starving in the same host. Malik, Julian's older brother, and Harper, their fiercely entitled sister, had spent their entire adult lives comfortably riding the coattails of the firm's algorithmic success. They held nominal board seats, collected massive quarterly dividends, and never once asked how the money was actually generated. But when their personal trust disbursements failed to clear the banking sweep on Wednesday morning, the illusion of familial loyalty instantly evaporated. I still possessed full administrative access to the firm's internal communication servers and security feeds. I watched the digital bloodbath unfold in real time from the quiet comfort of my sunroom. Harper cornered Julian in the executive boardroom just after lunch. She had just been humiliated by her broker forced to cancel the escrow on a multi-million-dollar private island villa because her proof of funds bounced. Malik, who owed millions to private equity creditors to cover his constantly failing real estate ventures, stormed into the room moments later and physically lunged at Julian. The audio logs from the boardroom security feeds were spectacular. They did not care about Julian's broken marriage. They did not care about Beatrice's ruthless custody ambush, and they certainly did not care about my frozen accounts. They realized with brutal, uncompromising clarity that Julian's pathetic need to impress a corporate spy had instantly vaporized their generational wealth. They were eating him alive. Harper demanded Julian sign over his remaining personal assets to cover her immediate losses. Malik screamed that he would personally hand Julian over to the federal authorities for corporate sabotage if it meant saving his own skin. The golden child was suddenly the scapegoat, drowning in the fury of his own siblings. While the Wilsons turned their executive boardroom into a vicious gladiator arena, I was quietly executing the most aggressive wealth transfer of my career. The clients Vanguard was poaching were sophisticated, but they were also panicked. They were fleeing a sinking ship and scrambling for a secure harbor. Vanguard offered a shiny new platform and aggressive pricing, but I offered something far more valuable. I offered institutional memory, absolute discretion, and the undeniable mathematical genius that had made them rich in the first place. Using my Delaware proxy Apex Holdings, I began deploying highly encrypted communications to the specific clients who were actively liquidating their Wilson firm portfolios. I did not introduce myself as Zora Wilson, the embattled and allegedly unstable daughter-in-law. I introduced my new fully legitimate financial management firm. I offered to absorb their fleeing capital at a highly favorable grandfathered fee structure. To close the deal, I provided verified historical data models proving that I was the sole original architect of the trading algorithms they had trusted for the past 5 years. Vanguard possessed the stolen blueprint, but I was the master builder. I knew every single vulnerability, latency issue, and blind spot in that stolen code, and I had already developed a superior next-generation algorithm to counter it. The response was overwhelming. The old guard of the Atlanta financial elite did not actually want to trust a massive impersonal corporation like Vanguard, and they certainly were not going to leave their capital burning inside the incompetent Bleeding Wilson firm. They wanted stability, and they wanted the mind that had consistently generated their returns. Within 36 hours, I had successfully migrated over $600 million in fleeing capital directly into my newly established Apex accounts. I was not just salvaging my own vested trust fund anymore. I had systematically cannibalized the entire client roster of my husband's family. I was no longer a rogue accountant fighting a defensive tactical war. I was the chief executive officer of a massively capitalized, fully operational wealth management empire built entirely on the ashes of their incompetence. Beatrice, cornered, suffocating and running entirely out of oxygen, finally realized the true scope of my maneuver. She could see the capital settling into new institutional accounts, and she possessed enough residual industry intelligence to know exactly who was holding the reins. Her bridge loans were denied. Her children were tearing each other apart in the hallways of her own building. Her legacy was a smoldering, toxic crater. But Beatrice still possessed one legal mechanism to exact her revenge. She had one final desperate card to play to ensure that if she went down, she dragged me into the abyss with her. At exactly 4:50 in the afternoon, a certified legal courier arrived at my front gate. He was escorted by my security chief directly to the front porch where he delivered a formal, heavily stamped corporate summons. Beatrice was calling a mandatory emergency meeting of the Wilson firm's board of directors for the following morning at 9 o'clock. The official agenda attached to the legal summons contained only a single heavily bolded item. She was initiating a hostile dilution of the firm's equity shares. Because I legally held 40% of the firm's shares, a concession I had brutally negotiated during the IRS crisis 5 years prior, Beatrice intended to force a board vote to authorize the issuance of millions of new, entirely worthless corporate shares. She planned to distribute these new shares directly to herself, Malik, and Harper. The mathematical maneuver was incredibly transparent and entirely malicious. It was designed to instantly dilute my ownership stake, dropping my equity from a commanding 40% down to less than a fraction of a single percent. She was going to use her final breath as the chairwoman to financially execute me. She intended to strip me of my voting rights, erase my corporate authority, and permanently kick me out of the company I had built with my own hands. She truly believed she could rewrite the rules of the board to simply erase my existence. The legal summons sat on my mahogany desk, the heavy cream paper bearing the embossed gold seal of the Wilson firm. I ran my fingers over the stark black ink detailing the agenda for the 9 o'clock emergency board meeting. Beatrice was not simply trying to vote me out. She was attempting to execute a textbook hostile dilution, a corporate execution masquerading as administrative restructuring. To fully understand the sheer desperation of her maneuver, one must understand the mechanics of how dying empires fight for their last breath. Beatrice could not just invent new shares out of thin air and hand them to her remaining loyalists. Corporate governance laws, even those loosely enforced by her expensive lawyers, required a mathematical justification. She needed a sudden, massive influx of capital that would require the firm to issue millions of new equity shares to an incoming investor. According to the deeply flawed prospectus attached to the courier's packet, she had rallied the few remaining terrified board members. Malik, Harper, and two elderly silent partners who had been too slow to pull their money out were now completely under her control. She had convinced them that the only way to survive Vanguard's devastating attack on their algorithm was a massive immediate restructuring of the firm's commercial debt. To achieve this, Beatrice had approached a notoriously predatory private equity syndicate known as Sterling Crest Partners. They were financial scavengers, famous for lending to distressed companies at extortionate bloodletting rates. Beatrice was offering them the literal bedrock of the Wilson dynasty as collateral. She was pledging the physical real estate of their downtown Atlanta headquarters, the firm's remaining liquid capital reserves, and the personal guarantees of her own children to secure a $50 million bridge loan. In exchange for this predatory loan, Sterling Crest would receive the newly minted shares, effectively drowning my 40% stake in an ocean of new corporate equity. My 40% would instantly be reduced to 0.4%. Once the shares were diluted and my voting power was eradicated, Beatrice had arranged a backroom deal to purchase those shares back from Sterling Crest through a secondary shell company, erasing me completely and consolidating her absolute control. She expected me to panic. She assumed I would show up at the board meeting with a team of litigators screaming about shareholder rights and filing futile injunctions to stop the vote. She expected a vicious, highly emotional brawl in the middle of her polished boardroom. I never fight where my enemy is prepared. While Beatrice spent the evening congratulating herself and assuring Malik and Harper that the bad days were over, I logged into my heavily encrypted terminal. I routed a direct, secure connection to the managing director of Sterling Crest Partners. They were predatory, but they were not foolish. Over the past 48 hours, their risk analysts had undoubtedly watched the Wilson firm bleed top-tier clients. They were experiencing severe buyer's remorse regarding the $50 million bridge loan they had tentatively agreed to underwrite. The collateral Beatrice had offered them was depreciating by the hour. A commercial headquarters is useless if the company inside it is completely bankrupt. Operating entirely behind the opaque, impenetrable shield of my Delaware proxy Apex Holdings, I made Sterling Crest an offer they could not physically refuse. I did not ask for a meeting. I did not negotiate. I simply transmitted a legally binding contract to buy the entirety of the Wilson firm's commercial paper and the pending bridge loan off their books. I offered them exactly 30 cents on the dollar. For a private equity firm staring down the barrel of 100% loss on a rapidly rotting toxic asset, a guaranteed 30% cash recovery is nothing short of a miracle. They did not care who Apex Holdings was. The Delaware Incorporation shielded my identity perfectly. They only cared that the digital wire transfer cleared their accounts instantly. The men at Sterling Crest were mercenaries, and mercenaries hold no loyalty to a sinking ship. The transaction took less than 40 minutes to finalize. The digital signatures authenticated the capital shifted from my fortified accounts, and the legal ownership of the Wilson firm's debt settled seamlessly into the vault of Apex Holdings. I spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the finalized debt transfer documents, drinking a fresh cup of tea as the sun began to rise over the Georgia pines. The sheer elegance of the maneuver lay in its absolute silence. I had circumvented Beatrice's entire legal strategy without ever setting foot inside a courtroom or a boardroom. I had bypassed the lawyers, the judges, and the media. I had struck directly at the financial arteries of her empire. Beatrice was currently applying her makeup, putting on her tailored suit, and rehearsing her triumphant speech for the 9 o'clock meeting. She genuinely believed she had just secured the financial weapon required to annihilate my presence in her company. She thought she had outsmarted me. She thought her alliance with Sterling Crest was the masterstroke that would save her legacy. She had absolutely no idea that Sterling Crest had quietly sold her debt in the middle of the night. She did not realize that when she walked into that boardroom and signed the final refinancing covenants, she would not be borrowing money from a faceless institutional private equity firm. She would not be diluting my shares to save her company. She was about to hand the mortgage of her entire empire, the deed to her corporate headquarters, and the financial chains of her children directly into the hands of the woman she was trying to destroy. Every single asset the Wilson family possessed was now legally collateralized under my complete control. The moment she defaulted on a single payment, the moment a single covenant was breached, I would not just own 40% of the firm. I would own everything. Checkmate. The morning after my invisible acquisition of the Wilson firm's commercial debt broke clear and brutally humid. I sat in my sunroom, surrounded by the quiet hum of my cooling towers and the soft glow of my monitors. Beatrice believed she had secured her $50 million bridge loan. She believed she had saved her empire from Vanguard Equities and was currently preparing her grand speech for the 9 o'clock board meeting where she intended to dilute my shares into oblivion. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her private equity saviors had already sold the mortgage of her entire legacy directly to me. But a collapsing empire does not just burn from the top down, it fractures at the foundation. While Beatrice was playing corporate warlord, her eldest son Malik was dealing with a completely different, infinitely more dangerous fire. The audit triggered by Beatrice's desperate bridge loan application had inadvertently opened the books on the family's philanthropic arm, the Wilson Heritage Foundation. The foundation was a tax shelter, a glittering public relations vehicle designed to host expensive galas and secure favorable write-offs. It was also the personal slush fund of Malik's sister Harper. When the auditors demanded a full reconciliation of the foundation's ledgers, a massive gaping hole appeared on the balance sheet. Exactly $400,000 in administrative grants had vanished over the past 18 months. I knew exactly where the money had gone. Harper had routed it through a series of dummy vendors to fund a lavish lifestyle that her standard trust disbursements could no longer support. She had bought a stable of show horses, funded a month-long excursion to the Maldives, and maintained a severe luxury shopping habit, all subsidized by money earmarked for pediatric cancer research. Malik, ever the self-appointed protector of the family name and his own fragile standing within it, had decided to play the hero. He could not let the auditors discover that his sister was embezzling from a charity. The scandal would not just ruin Harper, it would invite a microscopic federal review of all their personal assets, including Malik's own highly leveraged failing real estate ventures. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to take the fall for the missing $400,000 before the private equity analysts flagged the discrepancy. Naturally, he chose the woman his family was already trying to destroy. At 7:15 in the morning, a silent red alert flared across my secondary monitor. It was a localized breach notification from the Wilson firm's legacy accounting server. I had officially resigned as chief financial officer, but I had never surrendered my systemic oversight. When I built their digital infrastructure, I had embedded deeply concealed tracking scripts into the architecture of the administrative network. These scripts were designed to lie completely dormant until a specific highly restricted action was attempted. Someone was trying to use my digital signature. I leaned forward, my fingers flying across the keyboard to open a direct read-only terminal into the firm's server. I watched the keystrokes appear on my screen in real time. Malik was logged into an executive terminal in the downtown headquarters. He had bypassed the standard security protocols using an old master password Beatrice had likely given him. He was currently accessing the archived Foundation ledgers from the previous fiscal year. He was not just reviewing the files, he was actively altering them. Malik was pulling up blank backdated authorization forms. These were the documents required to transfer capital out of the charity accounts. He was filling in the destination routing numbers, linking them to a series of offshore accounts that Harper had undoubtedly used to launder the stolen cash. But the masterpiece of his absolute stupidity was the final step. He was dragging and dropping an old saved image file of my official electronic signature onto the approval lines. He was forging my authorization. He was meticulously manufacturing a paper trail that explicitly stated I had ordered the transfer of the $400,000 right before my departure from the firm. He intended to frame me for his sister's embezzlement, handing the auditors a perfect, neatly wrapped narrative. The disgruntled, mentally unstable former executive had not just hacked their current accounts, she had actively robbed their charity on her way out the door. It was a desperate, incredibly reckless maneuver that carried the mandatory minimum sentence of federal wire fraud. My encrypted phone began to vibrate against the glass desk. The caller identification displayed Malik's name. He was executing the second phase of his trap. He needed audio confirmation. He needed me to acknowledge the Foundation accounts on a recorded line so he could pair my voice with the forged documents and hand the entire package over to the authorities. I tapped the speakerphone button, letting the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment before speaking. "Good morning, Malik." I said, my voice perfectly level, betraying absolutely none of the digital surveillance I was currently running on him. Zora, Malik replied. His voice was smooth-coated in a thick layer of manufactured warmth. He was trying to play the reasonable diplomat, the calm older brother stepping into the chaos. "I know things have been incredibly tense lately. Mother is acting erratically, and Julian is a complete mess. I want you to know that I am tired of this war. I think we need to find a way to broker a truce." A truce, I repeated, watching his cursor on my screen slowly align my forged signature with a backdated approval line. "That is an interesting proposition coming from you, Malik. What exactly does your version of peace look like?" "It looks like walking away clean," he said smoothly, the false sincerity practically dripping from the speaker. "We drop the custody nonsense. You release the freeze on the operational capital. We let you walk away with your initial equity value, and we just end this. But we need to clean up some of the legacy paperwork before the new investors come in. The auditors are being incredibly tedious about the old files." He paused, letting out a heavy, orchestrated sigh. "I am looking at the Foundation ledgers from last year, specifically the administrative grants you authorized for Harper's initiatives, the $400,000. The auditors just need verbal confirmation that those were standard operational transfers you approved before your exit. If you can just confirm that for me, I can clear this audit up and we can start drafting a real settlement." He was waiting for the bait to be taken. He was waiting for me to say the word yes, or even acknowledge that I remembered the transfers, so he could clip the audio and seal my fate. He thought he was playing a masterstroke of corporate espionage. He had absolutely no idea he was playing with a woman who built the board. "Malik," I said softly, my eyes tracking the final string of code compiling on my screen. "Do you know what a biometric handshake protocol is?" The line went completely silent. The smooth, diplomatic cadence vanished. What are you talking about, Zora? Just confirm the foundation transfers so we can move forward. When I designed the security architecture for the firm, I explained my tone shifting from conversational to clinical. I knew that eventually one of you would try to forge my authorization. Your family is entirely predictable in its corruption. So I attached a biometric handshake protocol to my digital signature. It means my signature cannot simply be copied and pasted from an old PDF. It requires a physical encrypted token key that is currently sitting in my pocket. If my signature is applied to any document on the firm's server without that physical token, the system immediately recognizes it as a hostile forgery. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I watched on my monitor as his cursor abruptly stopped moving. It does not just flag the document, Malik. I continued, my fingers dancing across my keyboard. It activates a dormant tracking script. For the past 20 minutes, I have been watching you manually alter backdated financial records. The system has logged your exact IP address. It has logged the MAC address of the specific executive terminal you are sitting at right now. It has recorded every single keystroke you have made, and it has timestamped the exact millisecond you applied my unauthorized signature to a fraudulent financial transfer. Zora Malik stammered, his voice suddenly hollow and laced with absolute terror. You are bluffing. You do not have access to the network anymore. Check your private email, Malik. I pressed the enter key. A complete, unassailable 500-page forensic IT report shot through the secure servers and landed directly in his personal inbox. I listened to the silence on the phone as he clicked open the file. I listened to his breathing turn shallow and rapid as he scrolled through the raw data. He was looking at his own digital fingerprints permanently burned into a federal crime. You did not just try to cover up your sister's embezzlement, I stated, the icy finality of my voice ringing through the sunroom. You crossed state lines digitally to alter corporate financial records, to deceive a private equity audit. You just committed federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and corporate sabotage. You handed me the absolute destruction of your freedom on a silver platter. Zora, please, Malik choked out. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic whimpering sound of a man who realized he was about to lose everything. I was just trying to protect Harper. Mother forced the audit. We did not know what else to do. Please do not send this to the authorities. I will do whatever you want. I will transfer my shares. I will back you against Beatrice. Just tell me what you want. I do not want your shares, Malik, I said, leaning back in my ergonomic chair. I already own the debt that holds them. What I want is absolute unconditional surrender. I looked at the clock on my wall. It was 7:45. The emergency board meeting Beatrice called was scheduled for 9. You are going to walk into that boardroom today, I commanded. And you are going to bring Beatrice. And you are going to bring your wife, Elise. I know exactly how much of that stolen charity money ended up in her personal accounts. You are going to bring them all into that room, and you are going to sit quietly while I dismantle this company. If you attempt to warn Beatrice, if you attempt to delay the meeting, or if you so much as look at me the wrong way, when I walk through those doors, I will hit send on this file, and the FBI will be pulling you out of your house in handcuffs before dinner. Do you understand me, Malik? I asked, the silence stretching tight like a wire. Yes, he whispered, his voice completely broken. Yes, I understand. I terminated the call. The board was set, the players were trapped. It was time to go downtown and finally end the Wilson dynasty. I walked through the frosted glass doors of the Wilson corporate headquarters at exactly 8:55 in the morning. The entire top floor was a monument to Beatrice's ego, a sprawling expanse of imported Italian marble brushed steel fixtures and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. For 5 years, I had walked these halls as the chief financial officer, quietly managing the immense weight of the family's wealth while they took the credit. Today, I walked these halls as their executioner. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom stood closed at the end of the corridor. I did not knock. I simply pushed them open and stepped into the chilled, climate-controlled air of the glass-walled room. The atmosphere inside was thick with a toxic mixture of arrogance and absolute terror. Beatrice sat at the head of the massive conference table, her posture rigid, her hair perfectly coiffed, her face locked in an expression of supreme, unearned confidence. She looked like a queen preparing to banish a peasant. The rest of the family, however, painted a drastically different picture. Julian sat halfway down the table, staring blankly at the polished wood grain. The Vanguard Equities disaster had entirely hollowed him out. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life, completely destroyed by the realization that his pathetic infidelity had vaporized the firm's market advantage. Harper sat across from him, aggressively chewing her thumbnail while scrolling through her phone. She was annoyed to be awake this early, completely oblivious to the fact that the charity auditors had already discovered her embezzlement. And then there was Malik. Malik sat to Beatrice's right, and he looked as though he were physically dying. His custom-tailored Tom Ford suit seemed to hang awkwardly on his frame. A thick, noticeable sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead and upper lip. He was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately avoiding my gaze. He knew that I held the digital logs, proving he had committed federal wire fraud to cover up Harper's theft. He knew his freedom was entirely contingent on his absolute silence today. Beside him sat his wife, Elise, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver, looking terrified and entirely confused as to why her husband had forced her out of bed to attend a corporate meeting she had absolutely no business attending. "Take a seat, Zora," Beatrice commanded, gesturing vaguely to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table. "Or stand. It does not matter. You will not be here long enough to get comfortable." I did not sit. I remained standing near the entrance, my hands folded loosely in front of me, my expression entirely blank. "I am perfectly fine right here, Beatrice. Please proceed with your agenda." Beatrice smiled. It was a cold, reptilian curving of her lips. She genuinely believed she had orchestrated the ultimate masterstroke. She stood up, smoothing the front of her blazer, dripping with the kind of ancestral arrogance that only comes from generational wealth. "I am officially calling this emergency meeting of the Board of Directors to order," Beatrice announced, her voice projecting clearly across the room. "As you are all aware, the firm has experienced a temporary liquidity crisis over the past 48 hours. However, as the chairwoman of this board, I have successfully secured a comprehensive restructuring of our commercial debt through Sterling Crest Partners." Julian let out a dark, bitter laugh, shaking his head without looking up. "You leveraged the building, Mother. You mortgaged the only thing we had left. We did what was necessary to survive." "Julian," Beatrice snapped, her eyes flashing with venom. "Sterling Crest is providing us with a $50 million capital injection. However, as a condition of their underwriting, we are required to issue 50 million new corporate shares to collateralize the loan." Harper finally looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "What does that mean?" "It means," Harper, Beatrice said, turning her icy gaze directly toward me, "that we are restructuring the ownership of this firm. We are voting right now to authorize the issuance of those new shares. By doing so, the existing minority equity stakes will be proportionally diluted." She took a slow, deliberate step away from the head of the table, pacing like a predator circling its trapped prey. "For years, Zora, you have held this family hostage with your 40% stake. You thought your little mathematical tricks made you indispensable. You thought you could force your way into our bloodline, dictate our finances, and walk away with half of our empire when Julian finally came to his senses and filed for divorce. But you are not a Wilson. You have never been a Wilson. You are just a glorified accountant who forgot her place." I watched Malik physically flinch at his mother's words. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling violently on the tabletop. He knew exactly what was coming, and he was powerless to stop it. "With this vote, your 40% stake will be mathematically reduced to less than 0.5%. Beatrice continued, relishing every single syllable. "You will have no voting rights. You will receive no dividends. You will have zero corporate authority. You are going to walk out of this building today with absolutely nothing, and you are never going to step foot on this property again." She turned back to the table, slamming her hands flat against the mahogany surface. "I call for an immediate vote to authorize the equity dilution. All in favor. Beatrice raised her hand high into the air. She glared at Julian. Julian, defeated and exhausted, slowly raised his hand. Beatrice then turned her commanding gaze to her eldest son. Malik. Raise your hand. Malik did not move. He sat frozen in his chair, a single drop of sweat trailing down the side of his face. He stared at his hands, his breathing turning ragged. Malik. Beatrice barked, her tone cracking like a whip. Raise your hand. We need a unanimous board authorization to push this through before the markets open. Do it now. Malik slowly, agonizingly lifted his trembling hand into the air. Elise stared at her husband in horror, realizing something was deeply fundamentally wrong with him. Beatrice smiled triumphantly. The motion passes. She looked back at me, her eyes shining with pure malicious victory. You are finished, Zora. We have the votes. You are officially erased from this company. Pack up whatever dignity you have left and get out of my building. I did not move. I did not blink. I simply maintained my calm, clinical gaze, letting the silence stretch out in the room until Beatrice's smile began to falter. You seem to be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of corporate governance, Beatrice, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. You cannot vote to dilute shares without a quorum of the controlling ownership present. We have a quorum, Beatrice spat, gesturing aggressively around the table. The entire board is sitting right here. No, I replied smoothly. You are missing a few highly essential attendees. I reached behind me and pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open. Waiting patiently in the reception area were 3 individuals dressed in sharp, unassuming federal-issue suits. 2 of them carried thick, locked canvas briefcases. The third, a tall, imposing woman with silver hair and a completely neutral expression, held a leather portfolio. I stepped aside, allowing them to walk directly into the glass-walled boardroom. Beatrice's face contorted in absolute outrage. Who the hell are you? This is a closed private board meeting. Security. The silver-haired woman stepped forward calmly, placing her leather portfolio on the mahogany table right in front of Julian. She did not raise her voice, but her tone carried the undeniable weight of federal authority. Beatrice Wilson, I am Director Evans with the Securities and Exchange Commission, she stated clearly. These gentlemen are senior forensic auditors representing the Federal Oversight Division. We are here to formally observe the transition of corporate control as well as initiate an immediate mandatory audit of the Wilson Heritage Foundation accounts. Harper dropped her phone. It clattered loudly against the wood table. Her face drained of all color as the word foundation echoed in the room. Malik let out a quiet, pathetic whimper, dropping his head into his hands. Transition of control. Beatrice demanded, her voice rising to a frantic, panicked pitch. There is no transition. We just voted to authorize a debt restructuring. We own this company. Get out of my boardroom before I have you arrested for trespassing. I walked slowly toward the front of the room, stopping just inches away from Beatrice. You cannot vote out the majority stakeholder. Beatrice, I stated calmly, looking directly into her wide, furious eyes. It is a direct violation of federal corporate governance laws. You have no authority to issue new shares, and you certainly have no authority to dictate the future of this firm. Beatrice let out a harsh, derisive sneer, stepping aggressively into my personal space. She was practically vibrating with rage, her perfectly manicured hands curling into tight fists. You are delusional, Zora. Beatrice hissed, her breath hot against my face. You own 40%. My family holds 60%. The math is incredibly simple even for a glorified bookkeeper like you. We are the majority. You are nothing. I pulled a small black remote control from the pocket of my blazer. I did not break eye contact with her, as my thumb hovered over the primary button. The math is simple, Beatrice, I whispered. But you are looking at the wrong equation. I clicked the button. The massive digital presentation screen covering the entire wall behind Beatrice instantly hummed to life. The brilliant white light of the projector illuminated the darkened boardroom. I watched the expressions of Julian, Malik, and Harper transform from exhaustion to absolute unadulterated horror as they read the data displayed above their mother's head. I took a slow step back, gesturing gracefully to the illuminated screen. Look behind you, Beatrice. Beatrice turned slowly, her tailored blazer shifting as she looked up at the massive high-definition screen dominating the boardroom wall. The intricate, colorful pie charts and ownership graphs she had expected to see validating her hostile takeover were entirely absent. Instead, the projector displayed a stark, unassailable legal document. It was the master assignment of the commercial debt she had just signed with Sterling Crest Partners. However, the name Sterling Crest Partners had been aggressively struck through. In its place, stamped with the digital seal of a Delaware corporate registrar, was a new entity, Apex Holdings, LLC. Below the bold lettering of the holding company, the document detailed the complete transfer of all promissory notes, commercial liens, and personal collateral guarantees associated with the $50 million bridge loan. The document was digitally countersigned by the managing director of Sterling Crest and the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. Beatrice stared at the screen, her eyes darting back and forth across the legal jargon. She was a woman who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of high finance, and it only took her a few seconds to comprehend the reality of the document. The blood drained from her face so rapidly she appeared physically ill. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white as she struggled to keep herself upright. Julian, who had been staring at the table in defeated silence, finally looked up. He squinted at the screen, his mind sluggishly trying to process the corporate structure. He recognized the name Apex Holdings. He had seen it on the wire transfer logs the previous day, when hundreds of millions of dollars in fleeing client capital had vanished from their servers. Zora Julian breathed, his voice barely a whisper echoing loudly in the dead silence of the room. Apex Holdings is your proxy. I took a slow, measured step toward the edge of the conference table, smoothing the front of my jacket. I am not simply a proxy, Julian. I am the sole managing director. Harper, entirely out of her depth and growing increasingly agitated, slammed her hand on the table. Would someone please explain what we are looking at? Mother just secured the loan. We just voted to dilute her shares. We won. You did not win anything, Harper? I stated, my voice ringing with absolute clinical detachment. When your brother decided to impress a corporate spy in a hotel room, he did more than just hand over a proprietary algorithm. He shattered the foundational trust of this firm. Your valuation tanked by 40% in a matter of days. You became a toxic asset. I walked slowly down the length of the table, passing by Malik, who was now trembling visibly, keeping his eyes firmly squeezed shut. When Beatrice went begging to Sterling Crest for a lifeline, I continued. They saw an opportunity to prey on a dying animal. But private equity firms do not hold rotting debt when a guaranteed cash exit presents itself. They wanted out the moment they looked at your cascading liquidation requests. So I offered them an exit. I used the $25 million in liquid assets from my profit-sharing trust, the exact trust Beatrice tried to freeze, to buy your debt directly off their books. I purchased the entire $50 million note for pennies on the dollar. Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as the walls of her empire closed in around her. I am no longer your chief financial officer, Beatrice, I announced, stopping directly across from her at the head of the table. And as of this morning, my 40% equity stake is entirely irrelevant. You can vote to dilute those shares into oblivion. It does not matter, because I am no longer a shareholder. I am your primary creditor. I own the bank. The SEC director and the two forensic auditors stood silently by the glass doors, watching the corporate execution unfold with professional detachment. They were there for the foundation fraud, but they were witnessing a complete structural takeover. You cannot do this! Beatrice finally choked out, her voice cracking, stripped of all its former aristocratic command. You cannot simply buy our debt and claim ownership. We have a repayment schedule. We have covenants. The bridge loan is active. As long as we service the debt, you cannot touch the underlying collateral. I smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the smile of a hunter watching the trap finally spring shut. You are absolutely correct, Beatrice. As long as you maintain the strict operational covenants outlined in the Sterling Crest Agreement, the loan remains in good standing. I reached into the leather portfolio I had carried into the room. I retrieved a single crisp piece of legal paper bearing a stark red header. I placed it flat on the mahogany wood and slid it smoothly down the length of the table. The paper glided over the polished surface and came to a halt directly in front of Beatrice's trembling hands. It was a formal notice of default. Julian leaned over his mother's shoulder, his eyes scanning the bold text. He let out a sharp, panicked gasp, staggering backward, as if the paper had physically burned him. "What is this?" Beatrice demanded, refusing to touch the document. "We just signed the loan yesterday. We have not missed a payment. We cannot be in default." "You have not missed a payment." I agreed, my tone dropping to a whisper of pure steel. "But you missed something far more critical." I turned my gaze to Julian, who was now gripping his hair, his face buried in his hands. Julian was so busy playing damage control with the media screaming at his siblings and watching Vanguard poach his entire client base that he neglected his most basic administrative duty. He forgot to process the bi-weekly operational sweep. He missed payroll yesterday afternoon. The silence that followed was absolute. A missed payroll in a major financial institution is not just an administrative error. It is a massive, unforgivable breach of fiduciary duty. The covenants you signed with Sterling Crest were predatory and incredibly strict. "Beatrice," I explained, spelling out her destruction syllable by syllable. Section 4, Paragraph 2, explicitly states that any failure to meet fundamental operational liabilities, including employee payroll, constitutes an immediate and non-negotiable event of default. You violated the debt covenants less than 12 hours after you signed the paperwork. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, closing the distance between us. "I am calling in the loan, Beatrice, immediately. All $50 million is due right now." Beatrice collapsed backward into her leather chair. The supreme arrogance that had defined her entire existence had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare of absolute ruin. She was doing the math in her head, and the outcome was catastrophic. The firm was completely insolvent. They did not have $50 million in liquid capital. They did not even have $50,000 left in their operational accounts. "If you call in the debt," Julian stammered, his voice breaking into a sob, "the firm goes into receivership. We go bankrupt." "It is far worse than bankruptcy, Julian," I corrected, turning to face him. I looked back at the projector screen, clicking the remote one final time. The assignment of debt faded, replaced by the detailed list of collateral Beatrice had pledged to secure the loan. "Your mother was so incredibly desperate to maintain control of this firm that she did not just pledge the corporate assets, she provided personal guarantees. She pledged the deed to this corporate headquarters. She pledged the family trust funds. She pledged Malik's real estate portfolio. She pledged the title to your sister's equestrian estate. And most importantly, she pledged the deed to her own Buckhead mansion." Harper began to cry, a high, panicked whimpering sound, as she realized she had just lost everything. Elise, Malik's wife, stood up and quietly walked out of the boardroom, refusing to look at her husband as she abandoned the sinking ship. "Every single asset you possess is now collateralized under my holding company," I stated, my voice echoing with finality. "Because you are in default, I am initiating immediate asset seizure. Apex Holdings now owns this building. I own your trust funds. I own your homes." I looked down at Beatrice, who was staring up at me with tears finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup. She was entirely broken, stripped of her wealth, her power, and her legacy. "You have exactly 1 hour to vacate my building, Beatrice, or I will have my security team physically remove you from the premises." The boardroom instantly collapsed into pure, unadulterated pandemonium. Harper let out a guttural, hyperventilating wail, her perfectly manicured hands clawing at her own hair as the reality of her impending poverty set in. She looked wildly at Malik, screaming that he was supposed to fix the audit, entirely unaware that her brother was currently calculating his own federal prison sentence. Julian did not move. He remained slumped in his heavy leather chair, his eyes fixed on the mahogany grain, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his failure. Beatrice, however, was violently trembling. The immaculate mask of superiority she had worn for 40 years had completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. She looked at the federal agent standing impassively by the door, and then she looked back at me. Her voice, usually a weapon of aristocratic intimidation, was reduced to a hoarse, desperate rasp. "What do you want?" "Zora." Beatrice breathed, leaning her weight heavily on her hands, just to keep herself upright. "You have the debt. You have the collateral. What else is there?" I took a slow step forward, allowing the cold silence of the room to amplify my words. "I want exactly what you asked for when you ambushed me in my hospital room, Beatrice." I told her, my voice ice cold. "I want a clean break. You stood over my hospital bed while I was recovering from delivering your grandchildren, and you tried to buy my children for $25 million. You thought my maternal bond had a price tag. You thought my dignity could be purchased. Instead, I bought your entire legacy." I reached into my leather portfolio for the final time. I withdrew a single legally binding contract, 50 pages of dense corporate restructuring, and placed it directly over the notice of default. "This is a total equity transfer agreement," I stated, tapping the signature lines at the bottom of the front page. "You, Julian, and Malik are going to sign over your remaining 60% of the firm's shares to Apex Holdings. You are going to surrender every last drop of corporate authority, intellectual property, and brand equity to me." Malik let out a choked, hysterical laugh, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "You already took the collateral, Zora. Why would we give you the actual company?" I turned my gaze to him, watching him shrink under the weight of his own hubris. "Because, Malik, if you sign this contract, I will offer you a severance package. My severance package is that I do not hand this federal audit team the encrypted server logs detailing Harper's $400,000 charity embezzlement. I will not hand them the IP logs proving you committed federal wire fraud to forge my signature and cover her tracks. And I will not hand the Department of Justice the offshore routing numbers Beatrice used to bribe Judge Carter during the custody hearing." Beatrice flinched violently. Her eyes darted toward the SEC director, who remained perfectly still, observing the exchange. Beatrice had thought her judicial bribery was buried securely under layers of untraceable shell companies. She had absolutely no idea I had cracked those accounts weeks ago. "You sign this firm over to me," I continued, my gaze sweeping across the terrified faces of my former family, "and you walk out of here with nothing but your freedom. You refuse, and the three of you will be spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Beatrice stared at the contract. Her pride, a monstrous, all-consuming entity that had dictated her entire existence, was fiercely warring with her basic instinct for survival. She could not fathom surrendering the Wilson name to a woman she viewed as completely beneath her. She hesitated, her hand hovering nervously over the silver pen resting on the table, her jaw locked in a rigid line of defiance. I did not have time for her aristocratic ego. I pulled my encrypted phone from my pocket, punched in the direct unlisted tip line for the Department of Justice Corporate Fraud Division, and placed it face up on the mahogany table. I tapped the speaker button. The line clicked. A sharp, automated ring echoed through the silent boardroom. It rang exactly once. Beatrice lunged forward, snatching the silver pen with such violent force she nearly knocked over her crystal water glass. She pressed the pen to the paper, her hand shaking so violently the ink blotted against the heavy stock. She signed her name, severing 40 years of ruthless corporate dominion in 3 jagged strokes. She shoved the contract toward Julian. He did not even read the terms. He simply signed it, his eyes dead, his spirit entirely broken. Malik grabbed the pen next, practically tearing the paper in his haste to secure his absolute immunity from federal prosecution. The empire they had held over my head for years, the generational wealth they had wielded as a weapon to control, belittle, and discard me, was now legally entirely mine. Beatrice stood up, her chest, heaving, her eyes burning with a toxic, impotent hatred. She leaned across the table, desperately trying to salvage one final shred of superiority. "You think you have won?" She spat, her voice dripping with venom. "But you will never survive in elite Atlanta society without our name. They will never accept you. You are just a stray dog playing in a mansion. I picked up the signed contract, sliding it safely into my portfolio, and met her furious glare with absolute tranquility. You are confusing old money with actual power, Beatrice, I reminded her, my tone devoid of any emotion. Elite society worships capital, not names. And right now, your net worth is exactly zero. You have absolutely nothing left to offer them. I turned to the two private security contractors I had stationed just outside the glass doors. I gave them a subtle nod. Escort my former family out of my building, I commanded. If they attempt to take anything other than their personal coats, restrain them for the authorities. I watched them walk out. Beatrice marched with her head held high in a hollow, pathetic performance of dignity, while her children trailed behind her like beaten dogs. The SEC director stepped forward to begin her audit of the ruined foundation, and I quietly walked back to my newly acquired corner office. 6 months later, the Georgia sun was warm and golden. I sat on the expansive stone terrace of my private, highly secure estate, sipping a cup of herbal tea. Below me on the manicured lawn, my healthy, thriving twins were playing on a blanket, entirely safe and completely unaware of the ruthless war it took to secure their peace. The financial world moves quickly, and my newly rebranded firm, Apex Wealth Management, was absolutely thriving. Free from the parasitic drain of the Wilson family's incompetence, the proprietary algorithms I designed were generating record-breaking returns. The former Wilson clients who had migrated to my firm were exceptionally pleased, and the industry had quickly and efficiently forgotten the name Beatrice Wilson. Julian was currently working as a mid-level logistics manager for a regional shipping company. His modest salary was automatically garnished every 2 weeks by a strict court order to fulfill his massive child support obligations. He lived in a cramped rented townhouse, his luxury cars repossessed by the bank, and his elite country club memberships permanently revoked. Malik and Harper had quietly fled the state, terrified that the lingering shadows of their financial crimes might eventually catch up with them. They relocated to the Midwest entirely stripped of their trust funds, forced to actually work for a living while hiding the deep burning shame of their social exile. And Beatrice, her beloved Beacon Hill-style mansion, the absolute crown jewel of her social dominance, had been foreclosed on and sold at public auction. I had anonymously purchased it through a proxy, gutted the lavish interior, and donated the sprawling property to a local battered women's shelter. Beatrice now lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. She was permanently exiled from the high society galas, the charity boards, and the elite country clubs she valued far above human life. Without her wealth to enforce fear and demand respect, her former friends simply stopped returning her calls. She was a ghost in the city she used to rule. They thought they could discard the quiet accountant. They thought my silence was weakness and my compliance was a permanent condition. They didn't realize I was the only one keeping their fragile house of cards standing. And when I finally walked away, I pulled the foundation right out from under them. True power never stems from an inherited name or unearned wealth. It is forged through quiet resilience, strategic planning, and unwavering self-worth. The profound lesson here is that when toxic people attempt to diminish your value, you do not need to play by their rules. The ultimate revenge is building your own unshakable foundation, walking away from their chaos, and letting their blinding hubris become their spectacular undoing. Have you ever walked away from a toxic environment to build your own success? Share your incredible journey in the comments below, and please subscribe for more empowering stories of sweet justice.